Well, I want to welcome everybody here tonight. I'm Bart Loeser, if you don't know me, and I am the program director for our Toastmasters District 55's program, continuing education program, specifically focusing on a variety of different classes and programs and workshops that can help people to build skills, perhaps in addition to what you would normally learn on your average pathways projects. We have a special guest who will be here with us in the program as well, helping us out, and that's Erica Delaney. And I want to welcome Erica here. Erica is our program quality director. And let me just say that she's been in Toastmasters since 2009, which is as long as I've been with Toastmasters as well. And she's taken on many leadership roles, and I've known her for many, many years in those top roles. And she's now in one of the top roles for our district. And we're proud to have her help us out and help us to be the best we can be at this time. So I thank you, Erica, for being here. So thanks. So she's going to participate at various different points, bringing her perspectives as well. And I want to start off just covering what the agenda for tonight's going to be. I think somebody had mentioned a little bit earlier that they're here because they often have trouble finding a topic. So finding a topic that will work, especially as our contest season is going to be coming up soon. There are people who want to participate in the international speech contest, and some people who do might not be sure what exactly is it that works well. What could be a topic that could win? You know, what can I talk about? So we're going to focus on how to find a topic, what the purpose of a speech can be, because your audience is always going to be wondering when you're speaking. Tell us, why are you speaking to us? What do you want us to know? What do you want us to do? How do you want us to think? How do you want us to feel? What's the purpose of this particular project? And then we're going to focus on organizing your speech to make sure it flows well. That's a very important piece to having a speech that people can understand clearly, is how well you organize it. And then how you have transitions. They should be smooth and orderly, but having a good transition is just as important as the topic you're speaking about, going from different idea to idea and such. So we're going to go ahead and present that tonight. So let's start off with, where do we find topic ideas? I'd like you guys to share as well, where do you come up with your ideas? Mostly what I come up with when I'm thinking of a speech is what's going on in my life right now, or something that's important to me right now, something that makes me want to speak up. And usually it has something to do with some current events or something going on in my life. I want to find out from you guys, where do you find the topics for your speeches? Erica, let's start with you. When you're thinking about coming up with a speech, where do you get your best ideas?
Depends on what kind of speech I'm doing, but I'm very similar to you. It's something current. I like to keep it simple. And I'm the opposite of whoever was, I think, Candy, who overthinks hers. I don't think about anything. And I have trouble finding, doing a research speech or something more serious, but I love to tell stories. And I think of something that recently happened at work or in my personal life, family, a trip, and I find a way to talk about that trip or that experience and put in personal stories and make it humorous, use my type of humor with it. And that's basically what I do. And I can do that very quickly because I've been in Toastmasters so long, and that's my go-to, to keep it simple and to do something current and storytelling.
Great. And I've seen in the chat room, Rudy has said something I'd like to teach to the crowd, or a story that I'd like to tell about my life. That's one of the great ways to come up with topics, is to get an idea of what stories that have happened in your life that are either humorous or they taught you something. So, what is something that has happened in your life? And if you can tell a story around it, like Erica had said, it's one of the best ways for human beings to communicate with other human beings, because we love and we're attuned to stories, things we can learn from, or things that interest us. And so if you can take us on your journey in a story, that's a great way to present a speech. One thing that I've done that works well for me, especially when it comes to, let's say, the international speech contest, is what kind of speeches usually get to the top. What I find that gets to the top most are the speeches that are lessons that have been learned. And so one of the things you could do is you could actually do a search on the internet, which is what I do all the time when I'm trying to come up with an idea. I just want to find out what ideas do other people have out there. And so I'll just do a simple search, such as, what are the most common human life lessons that people speak about? So most typical life lessons. And when you look at those, they generally come up with a list of the most universal life lessons that you can imagine. So for instance, I'm going to show you guys something here on my screen. Just do a simple search here just to show you guys what I typically like to do for me. 24 of the most powerful life lessons. So that's just the top of them. You can come up with many of them, but this is an article that has a list of things here. So life lessons could be, make yourself necessary and you will always be needed. So what is something in your life that you might have a life experience where you can relate to that and say, oh, wait, I've got some stories like this. Or your thoughts are like boomerangs. Or you're more defined by what comes out of your mouth than what goes in it. That can be a fun topic to talk about. Because how many of us can come up with stories in our life where that sort of thing has happened? Or the journey of your success will always begin with a small step of taking a chance. One of the last speeches that I evaluated was from somebody who said, the thing you have to do in life to be successful is just start. And then and he told a whole story that was just right around this particular life lesson. So this can help us to bring up ideas as well. That's the thing I love about that, is that you can get great ideas from just what you see that's out there. So who else would like to share? Where do you get your ideas? Candy had mentioned in the chat room a topic that I've heard people talk about that I have information on. So that can be something. So something that's in the news or that is just popular that people are talking about and you know something about it and you want to give your opinion. So Michael, where do things come up for you? How do you figure out your topics?
I think very similar to you and Erica, things that most people, they always talk about is family, work, hobbies, pets, whatever. Mm-hmm. And then just like what I heard you say is you take a situation that you ran into and then you just sort of expand on that. And usually the formula that I found successful for me is to inject some humor in there. Don't take yourself too seriously. And also from there, try to do some type of lessons learned or something. And then try to make it so that when you do your speech and you bring the audience down, because if it's some serious topic, always turn it around and then, lift people up so that at the end, just like what you said, it's a life lesson, but, you leave it on a positive note.
And how many of us have life lessons that happen on a daily basis, especially life lessons that hit us over and over and over? I could write a really funny speech, although the challenge with this is this happened this afternoon. And generally humor is tragic things that with time can become humorous. It's not been enough time yet, but I would say this afternoon, I tried to fit in too many things into my day because I have this Superman complex. And if I can get all of this done, this plus this plus this plus this, and it just goes smoothly, it's like I win. I'll have a great day. And if things don't go smoothly, I have a terrible day. And of course, what generally happens in life? Do things go the way you plan?
No.
They do on a rare occasion, but typically they don't. But in my crazy mind, I believe, well, it should go the way I planned. Well, we all know life doesn't work like that. And I've got stories I could tell almost every day about things like that. And if I let those little things ruin my day would be ruined every day, all the time. It's kind of a crazy way to live your life. And yet that's kind of how I operate. So there are other funny ways or stories that you can just by taking note of what's going on in your life and your reactions to things that happen in your life are a great way to tell stories. I had my first great nephew was born this morning or yesterday morning and just came home today. And it's like, oh, well, now I'm going to go back up to the Dallas area to go visit them because now I want to see the new baby, even though I just saw all the kids 2 weeks ago. It's like, no, I'm not coming up there for Thanksgiving. And then it's like, oh, I'll be right up there. That's just my life. But there's lots of great ideas that can come about all the time. And so what this is all about is write down, like put on your computer or somewhere, keep a list of things that you could talk about, because there's always going to be opportunities to speak. And so you have to think about, what can I talk about? So not only coming up with ideas, because we have ideas that may hit us all the time, but write them down. And you might even put some notes to it a little bit. So that would be a great thing. So keep a notebook of those ideas around. How many of you sometimes come up with ideas in the middle of the night? You're sleeping, you wake up and you've got this great idea, and then you go back to sleep and you wake up in the morning and you go, I have no idea what that was. It would have been so perfect. Keep that notebook next to your bed, but write topics down. And if you can, expand on them. Well, what's the point you would make about that? Because every story has perhaps many different points it can make, but you only want to focus in a 3 to 5 minute or 5 to 10. What's 5? You only want to focus on a 5 to 7 minute speech, generally on one specific lesson. Because if you give people too many lessons to focus on, they'll leave there not sure what the lesson really was. And I'm sure we've all heard speeches like that too. Do you have anything you would like to add to that, Erica?
I do it very similar. And I've also started doing this thing with my speeches where I always try to end it on a lesson or something to tie it into that, because it seems like we're always thinking of that international speech contest. And even though I'm not going to be competing, but I still, over the years, I have competed, and I will do something like, I like to hike, camp, backpack, and I have a backpacking speech. And I was very excited to give this speech. I was doing the team collaboration path, and I thought, well, why do I have to give all my speeches on a project that's work or kind of boring? And I did it on planning this backpacking trip, and the end of it was a speech about the actual trip.
Oh,
and we had this theme. It was called Lighten the Load the whole time. Like, we're drinking our water, and backpacking in Texas is brutal. You have to carry tons of water with you and food. And we talked about lightening the load the whole time. But at the end, I put a little twist on it, like, that's, and tied it into a life lesson about, getting rid of your worrying, and, what are things that you can get rid of in life that you're carrying that you can get rid of to lighten the load. And it turned out really nice. It might actually be a contest speech one day, but I've been doing things like that.
Contest speech. Yes, exactly. So
I've been tying it into things like that. That's just
excellent. Yeah, I love that, because it's also simple. The lesson is lighten the load. You can actually bring that up several times, and there's lots of examples you can give of where lightening the load in your life, whether physically or mentally, emotionally, all of that, simplifying your life. Excellent. And it's a universal theme that anybody can relate to. So that's really a great idea, is keeping that. So there's a lot of different topic areas you can get, but I would say keep it simple. Everybody remembers the KISS, right? So keep it simple, silly. Don't complicate things so much, Candy. If you overcomplicate things, you end up never doing it at all, right? So talk about the things you know well: your work, your education, hobbies, habits that you have. That's one of my favorites to teach about, because there's so many life lessons from some of my crazy habits I've developed in my life. Sharing those personal experiences, so writing these things down to keep a library of these for when you might need to grab a story. Share some observation that you've made on things that are going on in life, just giving your opinion. Sharing success or lessons learned, an incident that impacted your life in some way. I hear some of the most powerful speeches are usually about some event that impacted their life, and that's what their speech is focused on. You could have a favorite parable. There's lots of famous life lessons that they find from parables, whether it's Mother Goose Tales or anything. You can learn powerful lessons and share. Many songs actually have great stories that can bring such memories together. I once gave a song a while back. It was about the Cats in the Cradle song that came out back in the 70s, about not having a relationship with his father when he was young. And I thought, oh, I can relate to that. Dad worked all the time, and I didn't know him well until we were both adults. And so that song was really impactful for me. So I actually used part of the song as part of my speech to talk about that issue. Perhaps a stance from which You can persuade people to your side. It's a great talent that we work on in Toastmasters, is the ability to persuade people. All leaders have to persuade people to want to follow them. So it's a great skill. So where do you want people to go? A topic of current events, as we talked about, any trends that are happening. You could see on a website, magazines, newsletters, things that just will get a thought going in your mind. Write that down, because I know the first moment I think, ooh, that would be a great speech. If I don't write it down, 10 minutes later, it's gone. Considering your speech, some things to think about is, what's the purpose of my speech? That's always a good thing to think about once you've got an idea. It's like, well, why am I speaking? What do I want my audience to think, feel, or do? Either they're going to take action, or they're going to think a certain way. You're going to make them go in a certain direction, or you want them to feel a certain way, or it might be a combination of all three. So that can be a powerful speech. But what's my purpose? Usually in Pathways, almost every speech you give is for a purpose. And so that's why it's an important idea to read through Pathways. And I'd say read through most of your projects and electives so that you can see what would be a good fit for your speeches. How many of us sometimes are coming to a meeting and we've heard that a speaker has dropped out and they're looking for a speaker, and you don't have much time, but you have a speech, you just have no idea what project to assign it to. So if you know ahead of time, after looking over your Pathways projects, what the different projects are, what they're going for, you might find the perfect thing through that. That's why the electives are one of my favorites to go to, because you only need usually 2 electives to complete, but all 13 of those at level 3 can fit almost every single speech I've ever done. So I've used almost all 13 of them in many cases. Get to know who your audience is. That plays an important role if you can choose that. I know that as a professional speaker, often when I'm going to go work for an audience, or even like in tonight's class, I have no idea who's going to be here or why they may be coming, other than here's the topic I'm offering, but what's going to meet their needs. It's great to know that beforehand, but if you don't, it's also a good thing to talk about at the beginning of the class to get some idea of what direction you might need to go, so to keep your audience engaged and meet their needs. That's not always the purpose of a speech, is to meet their needs, but how many of you would agree if your audience could relate to your speech and actually say to themselves, this would be interesting to me, they're going to be more engaged. So try to find topics that can engage your audience. And that's why I usually go for the universal stuff, because if you have people from any culture in your clubs or in your meetings who might hear your speech, you want to be able to find things that are fairly universal. You don't want to turn your audience off or have them not be interested. That's why you could even talk about some of those riskier topics, such as talking about politics or sexuality or whatever it is, as long as you're aware that your job is generally to speak about a topic in such a way where your audience will be receptive. So when you're going to talk about an opinion in Toastmasters or most places, if you want your audience to follow you a certain direction, you don't want to say something that they might find offensive. So you have to learn, and there's different ways to say those, but you learn how to present it in such a way where it doesn't have to offend. And that's the important thing. Talking about the length of a speech, if it's a 4 to 6 minute speech, sometimes people who are giving their icebreaker aren't sure how many words they're supposed to use. And generally for a 6-minute speech, at an average of about 125 to 150 words a minute, which is at this time about the speed that I'm speaking at. Now, sometimes I speak very fast. You can fit in more words that way, but what's the problem with speaking very fast? Because I want to say a lot. So I'm going to speak very fast and give you 1,200 words in 6 minutes.
It challenges your vocal variety. It's hard to hear you. It's hard to understand. You don't enunciate well. I could keep going. It's my favorite thing to do when I'm nervous.
It's my favorite thing to do because I'm always trying to teach people a lot in a very little amount of time. And most people say, I feel like I've been hit with a whirlwind, a tidal wave of information. Why don't you just narrow it down a little bit more and just give us things that we can swallow a little more easily? It's like, yes, I know that, but sometimes I forget to do that. Mina, thoughts?
Someone suggested this to me and it has worked for me. They said that take a Word document and time yourself, read it at your normal pace and time yourself. And so and for 1 minute. And when I did that, it looked like when I counted it, it was about 100 words per minute that I spoke. So for a 7-minute speech, I would have to write 700 words. I tend to speak a little faster than when I read. So that helps. So even if I'm at 700 words, I know it'll be somewhere between 5 and 7. So every person has a different rate at which, or pace at which they speak. But that exercise helps you figure out how many words would work for you for 7 minutes. So.
Well, thank you, Mina. And that brings up a good point that I learned something that a lot of people don't necessarily do, but you can have your computer read the speech for you. You can highlight the speech and then ask the computer to speak for you. Well, most people can do that with their computers. And it's a very interesting way to hear your speech come back at you. So instead of you giving your speech and trying to see how it flows or how does it come from the audience, they're not going to be using a lot of inflection and the vocal variety that you might be using with your speech. But when you hear your words come back to you and you can control the speed of it, you can get a sense not only of how long your speech is, but it gives also them a good idea of how those words come together and flow when they're not coming from your mouth. So it's a great other way you can learn your speeches as well. So it's a tool I use sometimes to help me remember the speech better instead of just practicing it myself and possibly hearing it back. I have my computer do it in the computer's voice. So that makes it an interesting perspective.
Is there
yeah, go ahead.
Is there a feature in your computer that lets you do that?
Oh yeah, you can highlight the words and then it just says speech. And so I go up to edit and I say, yes, I want it to speak to me, because it will read things like whenever I'm reading articles or somebody has sent me an email. Like, I'm a person with ADD generally, and that's not been diagnosed, but I've lived with it all my life. So how many of you get emails and they're just long emails with a lot of information and it's just torture to go through and you're tired? So what I do is I highlight the email, or at least pieces of it at a time, and then I have the computer read it to me so I don't miss anything, because I can miss stuff. So it's a tool that I use that works really well for me, but I've also used it in my speech writing. So it's been helpful. So you might see about doing that for your speeches. There's even programs you can get online where you can have your computer be one of those, like a monitor, where it just reads your speech at a certain speed, and you can adjust the speed so you can see not only how it flows, but and how it fits into your time frame, but you could use it the way people on TV use those monitors to actually say their speeches. They're actually looking at the monitor, reading the speech, but it doesn't look like they're doing it. So when they're, the news people and the others who do that. And there's actually lots of programs out there, software that can do that. So, and I can't tell you if some of them are expensive and some are not. So some are pretty cheap. If not, there may be some that are free. And you want to outline your structure so that people can have ideas that flow and it's easy for them to follow. Because the human brain generally tries to make sense of anything. That's both a great gift that human beings have, and it's also probably one of our worst enemies, because we make a lot of assumptions based on bits of information that we try to make sense out of. And so once we make sense out of it, then it's like it might be used to be logical about something that doesn't make any sense, but our minds try to make sense out of it. So that's something that, but having an outline structure of flowing from this idea to this idea to this idea, so people can follow the flow of your speech to add up to what you're trying to summarize. So one of the things I found, and you can look online, I know there's a speech worksheet for the icebreaker, and it's not necessarily all that helpful though for other speeches, because it's all about, why did you join Toastmasters? What are your goals? Things like that, which may not be the purpose of your speech. But I have found online that other Toastmasters have taken that type of a document and created their own speech worksheet, and you can download those. So it's easy to come up with, which generally a speech worksheet will have what your opening is, what your closing is, which you probably shouldn't even think about those things until you've written your speech. But then the other thing is, what's your main point? What is your subpoint? What is the second subpoint? What is the third subpoint? How do you back up each of these subpoints with evidence or a story? And how do you go from a transition from this point to this point? And so it's just the different pieces of your speech that actually can be outlined. So it's the bare bones of your speech, and you can then fill in the different areas and see how it flows, or take the speech you've already written and put it into that outline. And then you can break it down so that if you only wanted to have a couple words to glance at, so you're not going to read your speech, but you're not sure if you're going to remember how it flows, have a bare bones outline of the basic words or the basic story. I'm going to tell this story. And you haven't written the whole story out, you just know what the story is going to be, and you have the name of the story there. And then you're going to transition into this point, and you're going to use this story or example to explain why this is your second point. So that would be perfect, is to use a structure, an outline structure. And the thing I always recommend, and yet don't always do, because I sometimes give a lot of speeches last minute, write your speeches down on paper. Now that could be on your computer, it could be by hand. Some people say you've got to do it by hand. I do it mostly on the computer, and then revise it several times before you give it. How many of us have written a speech and that was enough work, and we give that speech without ever looking at it again the second time? It's just, that's the speech. I always can look back at a speech even after a week and say, I wouldn't give that speech this way now, where I'm at in my life. Looking at it again, it's like, ooh, I don't think I would give it that way. And great speeches, especially the ones that get to the top, are always being revised. You practice it, then you may revise it because it's not as smooth, or it doesn't flow as well, or you come up with better examples. Mina, you were going to suggest something.
No, I was thinking of that famous saying by Dale Carnegie, there are 3 speeches that you give: the one that you practice, the one that you actually gave, and the one that you wish you gave.
There's always regret. Yeah. Oh, I wish I had done this in my speech. Well, that one of the great things, and I will say this, when you write a speech that's pretty good, or a speech that makes a point, keep that speech. You can store it in your pathways. There's places where you can store your speeches and your evaluations, or keep them somewhere where you can go back to them. And of course, always date them, because you're going to wonder, which reiteration of this speech is it? When did I? But give these speeches over and over. You may not give them back to back, but you might give the speech this time, and then let's say in 3 months or 6 months, you give the speech again, but for a different purpose in pathways. So you could actually get through pathways and really only have maybe 12 speeches out of the 25 to 30 speeches you've got to give for a pathway, or for your path. You can give the same speech. You're always going to change it up though, and give it for perhaps even a different purpose. So, but that's the whole thing, is you don't have to come up with a different speech each time. That's something I try to remind people who are new to Toastmasters, because the number one stressor for most people who say they're going to take on a speech is they think, now I got to think up a speech. I got to come up with something. It's like, well, have a list of ideas, but better yet, see if you can repurpose a speech. Because the next time you do it could be for a different purpose. Maybe you have several life lessons that you could say about something, and this time you're going to teach about that this experience had this lesson, but then the same experience could have had other lessons as well. So you can use the same stories and the same speeches, but you're not going to say them exactly the same. That's why I suggest revising them and keeping them in your history. And then if you pick it up another 3 months later, you're probably not going to give that same speech as you look through it. You go, I wouldn't do it this way again. Do you have anything you'd like to add as how you do it, Erica, or anybody, if you'd like to share it? Yes.
I do it basically the same. I just wanted to add too, the best way to get good at all of this is to do it often. And Toastmasters is a very supportive environment. And that's how I got good at giving speeches, was I just gave a lot of speeches. I wrote a lot of speeches, and I kept writing them, revising them, and practicing them. And it really helps to speak regularly. And if anything I wasn't good at Toastmasters, I hated giving evaluations. I would just sign up to be an evaluator.
Very good.
I hated giving table topics, and it really helps to speak often and to constantly be revising and practicing, and you will get good at it. And the more speeches you write, the more speeches you give, the easier it'll be, and you will evolve, and you'll just keep getting better.
This is another point that I love to make when Erica says, speak often. Someone might say, well, I'm in a large club and there's rarely opportunities to speak. How many clubs do we have that you could attend their meetings? Thousands. You could go to thousands of different clubs all over the world. We have someone here who's in India right now in this particular meeting. You could go to meetings anywhere in the world, and if you go to a smaller club, they're usually desperate for speakers or desperate for evaluators. And so if you go to a smaller club meeting, you could show up either, or you could even ask ahead of time if you could give a speech ahead of time, but you could also just show up with a speech in your pocket or a speech that's prepared and say, hey, I was wondering if there are any opportunities today to give a speech and get evaluated. And if you go to most smaller clubs, they usually would be very grateful to have you there to do that. So you could give speeches several times a day if you wanted to. That's why I tell Toastmasters that once you're a Toastmaster, you can go to many, many meetings, as many meetings as you want to go to. You could fill your life up with Toastmasters meetings if you wanted to, if you had that time, giving speeches, playing roles, but learning as you go. It doesn't just have to be your club. I'm a member of 2 clubs, but I'd say suggest to people that you don't even have to be a member. Just go introduce yourself at other clubs, especially find the smaller ones. And right now, because of COVID, there's a lot of clubs that are struggling for members. And they would love to have someone who come in who knows what they're doing, who could help out their meetings. So I definitely recommend that. So let's look at some of these pieces here. The purpose of a speech. Generally, it is said that there are 4 basic purposes for a speech. One is to inform people. I'd say probably about half of the speeches that I give are all about informing people or educating people. That's my teaching them life lessons or teaching them lessons of any sort. Professionally, I love people teaching people lessons and skill sets that will help them in the workplace. That's my passion. And so I do a lot of that. And so I give a lot of speeches to inform. Speeches to persuade can be anything, especially if you want to persuade somebody to go see a movie. If you wanted to persuade someone to go to a particular type of restaurant, that can be a speech. So there's lots of ways to persuade people to your side. Generally, I would say, if you really want to persuade someone to your side, always listen to them first. And, and probably it's a good idea to validate how they see it first if you want them to listen to how you see it, if it's different from how they see things. But when you're giving a speech, essentially a speech is a one-way conversation. It's a one-way way of addressing your particular issues. So in Toastmasters, we don't have usually a two-way conversation, although in these particular classes, I do love to have it be much more interactive. So, but speaking to persuade is a very important skill set. Motivating people, whether it's with energy, motivating people to want something, to think something's important, to find out what's in it for them. And if you're writing a speech and you want to motivate them, you want to find out, well, what would be in it for them to do this, to think this way? So motivational speeches. And lastly, just to entertain, whether it could be an entertaining story or it could be an event, it could be just something that will entertain people, make them laugh, make them cry, make them feel. Entertainment is a powerful tool in speaking. So anything, anybody here want to add about these, about how you do that? What is the typical type of speech that you give? Who would like to share?
I feel like I usually inform, but I always have threads of entertain in there as well. I always try to put humor in my speeches, mostly because humor is my defense when I'm nervous. So when I make it part of the speech, it blends in so nicely.
And Candy, you bring up a perfect point here. Sometimes you could do all four. How many would agree? It would be a pretty good speech if you inform me about something and make me interested in coming over to your side. And I feel motivated to do so by your speech, and I've been entertained at the same time. It's almost the perfect speech. So yes, you really want to do a little of all four generally. So if you're going to inform someone, you want to make it fun. You want to also probably have them try it. You also want to give them a reason to want to try it. So yeah, it can be all four of these pieces. So that's one of the things I'd say is make sure what your purpose is, but generally there's going to be a primary purpose to your speech. And that's, so you focus everything around that primary purpose, but you can pad in the rest of the things, especially the humor and certain things that make it more interesting to your audience. When you organize your speech on how it's going to flow from one idea to the next, you could do it 4 basic ways. One is chronologically, telling it by how it happened in a time sequence, generally from something that happened from the past to the present to the future. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly like that. You could talk about something from the past, and then you could jump to the future, and then you could go back to the past and move through it, but doing it in a way that people can get an idea of when this was, when did this happen to you, and how it flowed over time, chronologically. But you can also talk about something spatially. When you're discussing several different issues, you could actually talk about how does that relate in terms of not just when it happened, but just how they're related to each other, where they fit into this world or into space. It could be talking about your family and saying, okay, well, I'm going to talk about my parents, and then how my parents have influenced my great nieces and nephews. But then again, they also, even though they're gone, I'm able to take what my parents taught me and teach these things to them. So my parents are still very much alive as far as my nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews are concerned. They still have an influence on their lives. That would be more spatial. Topically, obviously finding some sort of topic that you're going to speak about and to blend them together in some way and talk about how that relationship blends. So you break it down by elements or components. And then the most typical way people tell stories that draw us in is the sequence of the story. Now, you can move the sequences around to even make them more interesting. A lot of movies will do that sometimes. They'll start off with what the result was, and then stop at some point and then go back in the history and tell how it led up to that point. Movies are a great example about how things are organized. You can actually look at different movies, pick movies and say, well, is it chronological? Is it spatial? Is it topical? Or is it sequential? And it can be a combination of such. So that's another thing to think about. But you want to make sure you have an idea of how do you want you to organize your speech. The speech worksheet is one of my favorite tools to use. So I'm going to just give you some ideas for what you can do to organize your thoughts in your speech. And I'll use this same method in the next workshop that we're going to be teaching tonight on table topics, because how many of you would agree when you have a table topic, it's got to make some sense. It's got to entertain. It's got to flow in a way where we think you've given some thought to this. And it might have a purpose. What's your point? So always prep your speeches is one of my favorite things to teach people, which is the P standing for in prep is what's your point? What are the reasons for your point? Because people are going to go, well, if that's your point, why is it your point? And if you can give some examples, that's the E for why it's your point. Tell a story or give some examples that back up your point, and then reiterate your point. It's like the perfect table topic. If you go up there and they ask you a question, think before you say anything, think, what's my point here? And why is that my point? And what's an example that I could use to illustrate that point? And then repeat the point again. And that's basically a 1 to 2 minute speech, but you can also stretch it out into a 5 to 7 minute speech and even have subpoints. So you have your main message, and then you have those subpoints that can play into this. Stories or examples are very important for human beings because our stories are the things that interest us. What happened to you? What happened next? What did you learn from that? What were your options? What were your choices? Why did you choose that? What happened? So stories and giving examples help us to relate to the topic. And of course, keep in mind, and I work on this usually afterwards, is the transitions from one point to another, because you want to make sure you can flow somewhat smoothly instead of just ending and talking about something and then start in another direction. Because you can do that, but it can be disruptive for the speaker's ear. So having a way to smoothly move toward into the next point is a great way to do that. So coming up with these transitions. Once you've done all of that, written the bare bones of your speech, then is when I suggest think about adding humor, emotions, and other ways that you can decorate your speech. It's almost like setting up the Christmas tree, getting it into the planter and getting it all set up and ready, and then decide to put your lights on and then decide where the ornaments are going to go. But that's something you do after you've set it all up. So you got the basics done, then figure out where's the humor, what's funny in this. And if you're not sure in your speech what's funny in it, read your speech to somebody else, or give somebody else your speech with the assignment of, is there anything in here that you think I can draw some humor out of it? That's something that I'm really good at. I'm not very funny with my own speeches, but once I've written a speech or hear somebody else's speech, generally I can find things that are entertaining and humorous. I could say, you want to work on this point and draw it out a little bit more. It's like, so come up with things that are funny. Like once I was diagnosed when I was 25 years old with a life-threatening illness. And I was scared to death to even find out, if that was true, could this be? And I didn't want to get tested even. I didn't want to know, because if it was bad, then my life would be over. And I didn't want to know it. Well, I finally got tested and found out it was true. It was positive, and I was going to die. And it's like, oh, that was a tragic speech. But actually, one thing the doctor said after telling me the results, they did say, oh, and by the way, your cholesterol is a little high too. You might want to work on that. And I thought, you just told me I'm going to die, and I have to work on my cholesterol, something that might kill me 30 years from now. And it brought lightness to the story. And you'll hear this a lot when you listen to some of the great stories that are out there. When you listen to the World Championships of Public Speaking, they'll usually tell a story that takes you on a roller coaster ride of emotions. They'll make you laugh. They'll make you cry. If you're going to make someone cry and make them feel, put them in a dark space, don't keep them there. You want to move people out of that dark space, and a great way to move them out of that dark space is with humor. One of my favorite examples is in a movie, and you might be familiar with this. It's kind of an old movie now, but Steel Magnolias. Everybody probably has seen Steel Magnolias, but if you haven't, watch that movie if you want to go through a roller coaster ride of emotions. It does that, but they also have those moments where they bring humor at that very moment, such as when Sally Field is in the cemetery scene. I hope I'm not spoiling for anybody, but the cemetery scene is a great example of someone experiencing great pain, tremendous anger at God, anger at life about how unfair everything is. And, she's just so angry. She says, I just want to hit something. She's so angry. And you're right there with her. You're just like crying and upset and just want to hold her, and just knowing the pain she's going through. And she just wants to hit someone. And then her friend grabs another of the friends and says, hit Loeser. We all want to do it. Hit her. and Loeser's like, what are you doing? Leave me alone. And it just becomes this hysterical scene. And they all stop for a moment just in shock, and then they break down laughing. And it just takes us out of that moment that's just so painful, and takes us out of it with humor. It's such a powerful thing. These are what the winning speeches do often. When I competed in 2010 and gave a speech, mine was all about I was going to teach people about emotional intelligence, and how when your buttons get pushed, what can you do? Can you cut the wires to those buttons so you don't react? And so it was all about our emotional buttons. And it was a great speech, and it was funny. But when I heard David Henderson give his speech, I just sat back and said, oh no, he's won. We were in tears, we were laughing. It told us so much. It was touching, it was vulnerable, it was everything that was perfect in a speech that took us on a roller coaster ride in 5 to 7 minutes and just left us feeling so good at the end. So if you ever get a chance, watch David Henderson's speech in 2010. It went straight from the district to the very top. And I thought, well, I didn't feel so bad about losing to the world champion, but how he did it was just amazing. And I said, I need to be a little more personal in my speeches, I think, because I was all about informing and not being very vulnerable. So, and of course, adding things such as analogies. People love to hear comparisons. Allegory, telling a story of how it relates to another story, and alliteration, using words that, like I always like to say, I'm going to talk about table topics. So let's start with terrific table topics and TTT. These things that are just that fun ways to use language. So these are things that you use to decorate your speech as you go. Is there anything you might want to add to this, Erica? I know I'm kind of taking over a lot of this up.
No, you're doing a great job. I think everything's perfect. I was just going to say that you can You can also use these things of like adding humor and stories to the speeches and pathways that everybody has to give those stock speeches, like what kind of leader you are, your speech about mentoring. I got some really great feedback from a member a couple years ago when I gave one of those, and he said, add some personal stories to this. And ever since I started doing that, it's made those a lot easier and a lot better, because I think I'm on my 5th path, and it's like, if I have to give one of these one more time, but these are just really good tips for any kind of speech, and you can spice up any type of speech with these tips.
And people love personal stories. They love getting to know you more, at least feeling like they know you. How many of us have TV characters or people in movies, and even though they're the actors, you feel like you know them? It's like, oh, I know what they're like now. It's like, no, that was a character they were playing, but they shared that. And people are just drawn to that. It's a great human element. Some other ways to enhance your speech is, at this point, once it's written, decide how you're going to deliver your speech, what you're going to say, where you're going to emphasize words. So after I've written a speech, I usually go in and mark it up about, stretching out a word or a phrase, pausing here. And so I'll find different points that have those elements that will make the speech more powerful with those vocal elements. Emphasizing, pacing. I'll say things faster in some places and slower in others. And I actually mark that on my speech where I do that. And it's a great way to remember when you're going through your speech how to then present it, because the speech isn't about the words you say as much as how you say those words. And as many of you may know, that's just about 1/3 of how people take your message, is how you say those words. The words themselves is just actually a small part of it, but how you look saying those words, your facial, everything you're doing with your face, your hands, your body. So if I was speaking, I might want to stand up when I'm speaking to you so you can see, and I've got more space to work with. I've got this whole box. So you want to do things where people can see your body and you develop specific motions. If I'm using numbers, the first thing that happened, and I'll hold up my hand, and then the second thing, and you don't even have to say second thing. You could just do this. And then, and people get, oh, it's the second thing. It's a powerful way to communicate. Figuring out what those dramatic pauses are going to be. Sometimes pauses are the most emotional element you can add to your speech. So coming up with those great pauses and coming up with the great visual elements. What could you do? One great way to get that feedback from other people. What could I do here to make it more visually attractive, more interesting visually? Get someone else to give you feedback on what you could do, what gestures you could do, what you could do with your body. If you listen to Mike Carr, who won the world championship 2 years ago, Mike he had to give his speech on Zoom, which is what we're doing these days. And he used this little tiny window to play with the elements of the camera and things like this. You should know, you could do different things with just playing with the camera and turning your body and doing things. So lots of different ways in which you can use this, but get feedback from other people. That's why I always say, if you're going to give your speech, make sure you practice your speech with somebody else as well, where they can give you feedback as you go. But you want to think about getting feedback on adding these elements to enhance the speech. So when you begin your speech, you want to make a bold statement from, maybe it's going to be a point of view you're going to make that statement. Ask a question, tell a story, get the audience to laugh right away, or ask the audience to envision something. That's why setting the tone, it was the summer of 1965. The hottest summer, and you can tell this, and you just set the tone for your audience. So that's a great thing to do. And concluding your speech, which I always suggest writing these things at the end after you've written the basic body of the speech, then decide how you want to open it, how you want to close it, or make changes so you can highlight those. Obviously, in concluding your speech, review your points. So if what I thought, and if you can do it without necessarily saying to summarize, you can do that, but if you can do it without saying that, it's even better. So review the points, maybe have a call to action. What do you want your audience to do with this information, if it's applicable? Refer back to your opening. So if you told a story at the beginning, see if you can find a way to weave back through and refer back to it. I always recommend that too with table topics, of coming back to your opening. And then close with impact. have some sort of way in which you close that's memorable if you can. So essentially, what we focused on today was how to make sure to target a topic. Again, that's alliteration. Keep it simple, silly is one of my favorite things to remember. That's why you should talk about things you know well. You can't do that with every speech, but generally talk about things that you know well, your own experiences. Although you can use other people's stories. There's great ways to find other people's stories, like in business, when I'm telling business success stories, I don't have to tell just my success stories. I can tell many people's stories, and they're all out there. You can also decide on what your speech purpose is based on usually the projects you're working on in Pathways, and always read that Pathway project first before you start to write your speech, because it may be very specific about how they want you to give your speech or what it should be about. And sometimes it takes a certain amount of time of doing certain work before you actually can give the speech. You want to organize your speech with a good outline. Again, use that, I'd say go ahead and download the outline, the worksheet that you can find. And after you've written the basic speech, then look for those elements that you can enhance, where you can enhance, and get feedback from other people. Add those vocal and visual elements as well, the humor, the other things, the alliteration. You can change up those words. Find better words that illustrate what you're saying better than the words you may have written the first time. How many of you sometimes have written down something and you're thinking, but that's not quite saying it the way I want to say it? Well, just write it down anyways. And then later you can go through it and find something that might be a better word or a better verb or an adjective that can describe that better. And then practice, practice, practice. Edit your speech each time you practice. Make changes as you go. But essentially, it shouldn't have to be too hard writing a speech the first time. And then you just keep going over it and just adapting it, updating it, and improving it as you go. And give that speech over many times in your club and other clubs. I hope you guys found this fun. It's been recorded, so we're going to be able to share this, guys, with people who work here today. But I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next meeting.